Dawn over the abyss. Picture this. Dawn on the 27th of June, 1950. The air over Kimpo Airfield is thick, heavy, like lead. It smells of smoke, the acrid scent of burning Seoul suburbs, and fear. It's a smell familiar to anyone who went through the hell of the Second World War. It seeps into your lungs, your clothes, your very soul. The most terrible war in human history had ended just 5 years earlier, and now, as if by some devilish pendulum swing, it was all starting again. Only this time, brother was fighting brother. North Korean troops are a tidal wave, sweeping away everything in their path. They are already in the streets of Seoul. The American transports, frantically loading on the other outskirts, are the last thread, the thinnest lifeline for diplomats and civilians. In the sky, an ominous silence, broken only by a distant rumble. The new, shiny jet-powered F-82 shooting stars streak by like dragonflies. They are the future. They are fast, swift, but their fuel tanks hold just a sip of gas. They can appear, make one single pass, and then they have to turn back. They cannot stay. They cannot patrol. They are a flash of lightning, not a sentry. And then, in this chaos, in the morning mist saturated with stench, it appears. At first, it's just a strange, forked silhouette distorted by the heat haze. Then the outlines become clearer, and those seeing it for the first time have their breath taken away. It's wrong. 2 fuselages, 2 separate cockpits, 1 huge wing, connecting them into a single entity. 2 propellers, turning rhythmically with an ancient, almost ritualistic calmness in the air. It's not a dragonfly. It's a prehistoric bird, a pterodactyl, that somehow flew into the future which had already rejected it. This is the F-82 Twin Mustang. On board are pilot Major William Buck Hudson and his radio operator / gunner Lieutenant Carl Fraser. They aren't flying towards glory. They aren't flying to change the course of the war. They're just doing their job, covering the desperate people on the ground. And at that moment, from behind a ridge of hills, like a shadow, another silhouette emerges. A North Korean Yak-9, a piston-engine fighter from the Second World War, a relic just like the Twin Mustang. But for the guy in the Yak's cockpit, it's a modern machine. 2 eras, 2 philosophical approaches to aerial warfare have collided in the skies over Korea. The battle lasted seconds. For Hudson and Fraser, it was routine. Aim, squeeze the trigger. 6 12.7mm machine guns, hidden in the center wing, spew a lead downpour. A short, precise burst. The Yak, 9 noses over, a trail of black smoke erupting from it, and it plummets helplessly, crashing into the rice paddies below. Silence. It happened on June 27, 1950, the first U.S. aerial victory of the Korean War. And it was achieved not by a jet fighter, not by a symbol of a new age, but by this strange hybrid, this last gasp of the receding piston era. The F-82 Twin Mustang became the only piston-engine fighter to take part in this war, which, by all accounts, was supposed to be dominated exclusively by jet machines. Why? How did it happen that a project born for one war found its destiny in another, completely different one? This isn't just the story of an airplane. This is the story of how engineering genius outpaced its time, how political greed almost destroyed it, and how the cruelty of history gave it one last, fiery chance at redemption. It's the story of how the future doesn't always arrive when we expect it, and the past doesn't always leave when asked. Part 1. The conception of a twin. A project for a war that wasn't allowed to happen. To understand the phenomenon of the Twin Mustang, you have to mentally transport yourself not to the 50s, but to the height of the Second World War, to 1943. The world was on fire. In Europe, the Allies were pushing through Italy at an incredible cost, preparing for the D-Day landings. But for the U.S., there was another, no less important, and perhaps even more complex theater of war, the Pacific Ocean. The war with Japan was a war of attrition, a war over vast distances. And here a problem arose that no one could solve. The new super bomber, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, was an engineering marvel. It could carry up to 9 tons of bombs over previously unimaginable distances. The plan was for it to bomb Japan from bases in the Mariana Islands. Look at a map. The distance from Tinian to Tokyo and back is over 5,000 kilometers one way. Imagine that route. Long hours over the endless, merciless expanse of the ocean, where an emergency landing is tantamount to a death sentence. And now the question, who would cover them? Who would go shoulder to shoulder with them on this entire journey? The existing fighters were blind kittens. The P-51 Mustang, the king of the European sky, with drop tanks at a practical range of about 2,000 to 3,000 kilometers. That was enough to reach Berlin and back, but for the Pacific, it was a drop in the bucket. Mustang pilots returning from raids over Germany were on the verge of exhaustion. 6 or 7 hours in a cramped, vibrating cockpit, under constant tension, waiting for enemy fighter attacks, it drained even the toughest guys. Over the Pacific, a flight could last 10, 12, or even more hours. One pilot, 11 hours alone. Over the ocean, it was a path to a mental breakdown and physical collapse. Something had to be done. And this is where the man whose name is known only to a narrow circle of aviation historians enters the scene, a man whose contribution is hard to overstate. Edward "Ed" Schiller, chief engineer of North American. Legend has it he was sitting over the blueprints for the P-51, and his gaze fell on 2 drawings lying side by side. And it hit him. What if you just connect them? This wasn't a simple gluing of 2 airplanes. It was a surgical operation, the birth of a fundamentally new machine. North American engineers took not the ordinary Mustangs, but their newest, lightweight, and most advanced modification, the P-51H. Its fuselage was lengthened and modified. 2 such fuselages became the foundation. They were connected by a completely new center wing, a central wing section that wasn't just a bridge, but a load-bearing structure with its own strength reserve, and a common tail assembly that brought the 2 tails into a single whole. What was the result? The result was not just a plane with 2 fuselages. It was a symbiosis. The left fuselage was the primary one, with full flight instrumentation. The right one was simplified, but it also had controls in case the pilot in the left cockpit fell ill or for changing shifts on a long flight. Imagine, 2 pilots could relieve each other without interrupting the flight. One flies the plane, the second sleeps, eats, rests. It was a genius solution to the fatigue problem. But that's not all. The space in the center wing, between the fuselages, was the perfect place to mount a powerful radar. This is how the idea of a night/all-weather interceptor was born. One pilot flies the plane. The second is the radar operator, searching for targets in the night darkness or thick clouds. The power plant was 2 Allison V 1710-143-145 engines. Individually, they weren't that outstanding, but together, working in unison, they provided tremendous combined power, enough to carry a huge fuel supply and still achieve a speed almost on par with a single Mustang. The first prototype, designated the XP-82, took to the air on July 6, 1945. It flew, and it flew beautifully. It was stable, powerful, and, as pilots later joked, it had twice the chance of getting home because if one engine failed, the other would get you back to base. But fate is a lady with quirks. Less than 2 months later, in August 1945, with the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Second World War ended. Instantly. And just as instantly, all the grand plans collapsed. Peace had come. Pentagon budgets were being slashed at a catastrophic rate. Why was an expensive, complex to produce super fighter needed for a war that no longer existed? The initial order for 500 aircraft was mercilessly cut to 272. It seemed the Twin Mustang's fate was sealed. It would be built in meager numbers, serve a few years as a transitional machine, and then be sent to the scrap heap of history, or at best, to museums as a curious oddity. It seemed as how it would be, but history, as we know, does not tolerate this subjunctive mood. It had prepared a special role for this outcast aircraft. Part 2. Betty Jo and the record that became a legend. A challenge to the future. If the F-82 had never seen combat, it would still be remembered, thanks to one single flight that became not just an achievement, but a genuine challenge to the very logic of progress. It was an act that screamed, "Look, the piston era hasn't said its last word yet." February 27th, 1947. Honolulu, Hawaii. On the runway sits an F-82B with the serial number 44 to 65,168. On its nose is the name Betty Jo, the name of the crew commander's wife, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Thacker. The second pilot was Lieutenant John Ard. Their task seemed like madness: to fly from Honolulu to New York, without in-flight refueling, without additional drop tanks, only what a standard twin Mustang could carry. 11,632 kilograms of takeoff weight, most of which was gasoline. Imagine that courage. Over the vast Pacific Ocean, over the mountains and plains of North America. No landmarks, just the instrument needles and the endless drone of two engines. 11 hours, 12, 13, 14. They weren't just flying. They were flying to prove something. To prove to the skeptics that piston aviation was still capable of the impossible. To prove that this Siamese twin was not a mistake. They were flying to put a period in an argument that hadn't even begun, yet the argument between the old and the new. 14 hours and 32 minutes after takeoff, having covered 8,128 kilometers, Betty Jo touched its landing gear down on the runway in New York. A world record for distance for piston-engine fighters. A record that remains unbroken to this day. Why? Because after the F-82, no one built piston-engine fighters anymore. At all. This was the swan song, the final, dazzling surge of a departing technology. In an era when jet planes could barely manage 1,000 kilometers, this piston-engine giant, this relic, covered a distance 8 times greater. It crossed the entire continent in one go. This wasn't just a record. It was a message that, alas, no one heard. But it was recorded in the annals of history, waiting for its hour. Part 3. Economics and Politics. Why the Twin Mustang almost died. Let's take a minute to step away from the romance of the sky and look at the harsh reality of 1945 to 49. The world lay in ruins. Europe had to be rebuilt under the Marshall Plan. The U.S., the only superpower whose territory was untouched by the war, faced a gigantic national debt. Military spending, which had skyrocketed during the war, had to be urgently cut. And this is where we come to a key point. The F-82 was expensive, very expensive, producing 2 fuselages, a complex center wing, 2 engines. All of this cost the Treasury a pretty penny. Against the backdrop of mass demobilization and total cuts to the Army and Navy, such an aircraft seemed an unaffordable luxury. There was another, more important factor: politics. The Cold War was beginning. The Iron Curtain had descended over Europe. And the new enemy, the Soviet Union, was betting not on piston engines, but on jets. The MiG-15 appeared swift, threatening, symbolizing a new era. American generals and congressmen needed a bright, understandable symbol of superiority. They needed their own jet fighters, their own F-86 Sabres. The Twin Mustang found itself in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was a product of the war with Japan, but the world was facing a new, completely different threat. Its unique qualities, huge range, and patrol endurance seemed irrelevant in the context of a global confrontation where the main theaters were to be Europe and the North Pole, where distances weren't as vast. It was reassigned as a night fighter. It replaced the obsolete P-61 Black Widow, receiving SCR-720 or APS-4 radars, which were mounted in that very center wing between the fuselages. In June 1948, with the introduction of a new designation system, P, Pursuit, was changed to F, Fighter. So the P-82 became the F-82. This wasn't just a letter change. It was a change in philosophy. From a pursuit plane, it became a fighter, but a fighter that wasn't allowed to fight. By the start of the Korean War in June 1950, only 3 squadrons of F-82s were based in Japan. They were the last piston-engine fighters on the front line. They were considered a stopgap, a temporary solution until the new jet machines arrived in sufficient numbers. Their pilots were sometimes teased, called flying anachronisms. But it was these very anachronisms that were destined to save the day at the most critical moment. Part 4, Korea, the last dance of the piston giant. And so, we return to where we began our story. To that dawn over Kimpo. To the smoke, chaos, and fear. When North Korean tanks poured across the 38th parallel, American forces in Korea and Japan were caught completely off guard. There were no plans, no forces, no means to repel a full-scale invasion. The only thing that could somehow cover the retreating troops and evacuating civilians was air power. And here, all the advantages of the F-82 came to the fore. The jet F-80 shooting stars were, as I said, sprinters. Their time on station over the target was measured in minutes. But the Twin Mustangs could loiter in the sky. Their practical range of 3,605 kilometers and patrol endurance of up to 8 hours made them indispensable. They did what no one else could. They covered the evacuation. They flew reconnaissance deep into enemy territory. They worked as night interceptors, using their radar to hunt North Korean bombers that tried to attack airfields and ports under the cover of darkness. And they fought. They fought against other piston-engine planes, Yak-9s and IL-10s, which formed the backbone of the North Korean Air Force. In this old piston confrontation, the F-82 was king. Its firepower, survivability, 2 engines, and endurance gave it an overwhelming advantage. During the war, the modest forces of the F-82, of which there were very few, accomplished the following. Achieved 4 confirmed aerial victories. The first of them was that very Yak-9 shot down by Hudson and Fraser. Destroyed 16 enemy aircraft on the ground, strafing them at their airfields. Lost 11 aircraft in combat and another 11 in operational accidents, speaking to the complexity of the machine and the harsh operating conditions. They didn't change the course of the war, but they bought time. They became the shield that held back the onslaught while the U.S. moved its main forces into the region, while squadrons of F-86 Sabres and other jets arrived. They were the reliable workhorses at a time when the glamorous racehorses were still warming up at the starting line. By early 1952, when the skies over Korea were already dominated by jet MiG-15s and F-80SXS, the Twin Mustangs were finally withdrawn from the front lines. Their mission was complete. By 1953, they were completely phased out of service. The era of piston-engine fighters was over, and the F-82 became its last, great, and tragic symbol. A ghost in the sky. The lessons of the Twin Mustang. Today, only a few examples of the F-82 survive. One of them, meticulously restored, can be seen at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Ohio. It stands there, quiet and majestic, like a dinosaur in a natural history museum. Children point at it, surprised by its strange shape. Adults walk by, not understanding its true significance. And its significance is much deeper than it seems at first glance. The F-82 Twin Mustang is not just an airplane. It is a philosophical parable embodied in metal. First, it's a lesson that brilliant solutions are often born at the junction of eras. It was too advanced for the piston era and too archaic for the jet era. It was neither one nor the other, and in that lay its strength and its tragedy. Second, it's a story of how short-term political and economic calculations can bury the most promising projects. If not for the sudden outbreak of the Korean War, the Twin Mustang would have remained in history only as the author of a beautiful record. War, that terrible destructive force, gave a chance to prove its worth. Third, and this is the most important, the Twin Mustang teaches us not to write off the old. The future doesn't always arrive in a linear fashion. Sometimes technologies we consider obsolete turn out to be far more effective than the latest novelties under certain conditions. Reliability, endurance, the ability to work in any conditions, these are qualities that do not have an expiration date. The next time you see an airplane in the sky or encounter some technology that seems outdated to you, remember the Twin Mustang. Remember this two-headed dragon that in its day was the longest-legged, most enduring, and one of the most formidable fighters in the world. It reminds us that progress is not a straight line. It's a winding path where the past and the future hold a silent dialogue. And sometimes the past answers in such a way that the future has to listen. Well, that brings us to the end of our story about the last piston fighter. I hope I managed to convey to you not just the facts, but also that strange, bittersweet aura that surrounds this machine. So what do you think? Was it a brilliant design or an evolutionary dead end? Could the Twin Mustang find a place in the modern world, for example, as a long-range patrol aircraft? I know you have an opinion. Be sure to write it in the comments below. Let's argue. Let's discuss. And of course, if you found this interesting, if you want to keep hearing stories about forgotten technology, incredible engineering solutions, and turning points in history, subscribe to the channel and hit that bell icon. Your support is the signal that such topics are needed and important. Thanks for staying with us until the very end. Until next time,